The Traitor's Sentence. The Case of Sergeant Ryker. Date: Winter 1954. Location: United States Army Stockade, Tokyo, Japan. The silence of death row is not empty, it is heavy. It presses against the eardrums, filled with the unseen weight of impending judgment. In a cold, damp isolation cell in Tokyo, Sergeant Paul Ryker sat on the edge of a steel cot, listening to the rhythm of his own heartbeat. It was the only thing proving he was still a living man, because to the United States Army, Ryker was already a ghost. He was a file number marked for deletion. He was a stain on the uniform. The charge was treason. Article 104 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the ultimate betrayal. To understand the sentence, you have to understand the war. The Korean Peninsula in 1951 was a frozen hellscape. The wind cut through parkas like razor blades, and the line between friend and foe shifted with the drifting snow. It was in this chaos that Sergeant Ryker, a decorated combat veteran, a man of iron nerve and proven loyalty, allegedly broke. The prosecution's narrative was simple, brutal, and seemingly watertight. They painted a picture of a man who had walked away from his unit during the bloody stalemate near the 38th parallel. Ryker hadn't just deserted, he had crossed the line. When American forces finally advanced and apprehended him months later, he wasn't found in a prisoner of war camp, starving and beaten. He was found behind enemy lines, reportedly well-fed, wearing a mixture of Chinese and American gear, and seemingly collaborating with North Korean intelligence officers. When the military police slapped the cuffs on him, Ryker didn't fight. He didn't beg. He looked them in the eye with a terrifying calmness and said, "I was under orders." That statement became the center of the legal storm. Ryker claimed his defection was actually a sophisticated ruse, a black ops mission sanctioned by the highest level of field command. He claimed he was ordered to infiltrate the enemy, to offer them false tactical data in exchange for their trust, and to bring back vital intelligence on their supply lines. It was a suicide mission that required him to play the traitor so convincingly that even his own countrymen would want him dead. But there was only one problem with his story. The man who allegedly gave the order, Colonel Whitaker, was dead. Whitaker had been killed in action days after Ryker crossed the lines, his jeep obliterated by a mortar shell on a muddy road outside of Seoul. With him died the only corroboration of Ryker's story. There was no paper trail, no written orders. Secret missions of this magnitude were never written down. They existed only in the verbal agreement between a commander and his operative. This was the ghost order. The court-martial that followed was swift and merciless. The prosecutor, Captain David Young, dismantled Ryker's defense with surgical precision. He argued that Ryker was a desperate liar, a man who had sold out his country to save his skin and was now using the death of a hero colonel to cover his tracks. The jury, composed of officers who had seen their men die fighting the very enemy Ryker had lived with, was not inclined to show mercy. The verdict was unanimous: guilty. The sentence: to be hanged by the neck until dead. Now Ryker sat in his cell, counting the cracks in the concrete floor. The appeal process was exhausted. The execution date was set. The Army wanted this over. They wanted to bury the embarrassment of a traitorous sergeant. But Ryker remained stoic. He possessed the unsettling confidence of a man who knows the truth, even if the rest of the world calls it a lie. However, outside the cell, the gears of justice were grinding with a strange friction. Captain Young, the very man who had secured the death sentence, found himself unable to sleep. A nagging inconsistency in the timeline, a detail about the intelligence Ryker allegedly gathered, began to fester in his mind. The prosecutor was beginning to realize the terrifying possibility that he had done his job too well. He had successfully condemned a man who might be the greatest hero of the war.
The clock was ticking, the hangman's noose was being braided, and Sergeant Paul Ryker waited in the dark, holding on to a truth that was about to die with him.
The prosecutor's doubt. The burden of victory. Date: Spring 1954. Location: Judge Advocate General's Office, Tokyo. Victory in a military courtroom usually tastes like champagne. It is sharp, celebratory, and final. But for Captain David Young, the man who had successfully argued for the execution of Sergeant Paul Ryker, victory tasted like ash. The file sat on his mahogany desk, a thick stack of manila folders bound with twine. It was closed. The case was closed. The verdict was guilty, and the sentence was death. By all metrics of the Judge Advocate General's Corps, Captain Young had done his job flawlessly. He had taken a traitor off the board. He had protected the integrity of the uniform. So why couldn't he sleep? It started with a discrepancy, a small, jagged edge in the smooth narrative he had woven for the jury. During the trial, Young had argued that Ryker's intelligence gathering was a fabrication, a desperate lie invented after capture. But late one rainy Tuesday, while reviewing the transcript for the final report, Young found a footnote in the intelligence annex that stopped his heart. Ryker had mentioned a specific North Korean supply movement near the Chosin Reservoir. At the time of the trial, this was dismissed as lucky guesswork or common knowledge. But a new, declassified field report from the 1st Marine Division had just crossed Young's desk. It confirmed the movement down to the exact grid coordinate. The date of the Marine report was after Ryker was taken into custody. Young stared at the paper. The smoke from his cigarette curled into the stagnant air. If Ryker knew about that supply line before the Marines did, he couldn't have guessed it. He had to have seen it. And if he saw it, he was exactly where he said he was, deep undercover, gathering intel for the United States Army. The doubt started as a whisper and grew into a scream. Young realized he had prosecuted the case based on the absence of evidence, the missing written orders from the dead Colonel Whitaker. He had assumed that because there was no paper, there was no mission. But in the chaotic, frozen hell of the Korean War, paper was a luxury. Men died, jeeps burned, and secrets were buried in the mud. Young did something no prosecutor ever wants to do. He began to dismantle his own case. He pulled the logs of Colonel Whitaker's movements. He cross-referenced them with Ryker's testimony. The timeline, which he had ridiculed in court as convenient, actually lined up with terrifying precision. The moral weight of it began to crush him. He wasn't just a lawyer, he was an officer. If he let this go, if he let the execution proceed, he wouldn't just be killing a man, he would be killing a loyal soldier who had walked into the mouth of the beast for his country. He requested a meeting with the general. It was career suicide. You don't walk into a general's office and tell him the army made a mistake. You don't tell him that the traitor everyone hates might actually be a hero. "Captain," the general said, his voice like grinding gravel, "the man is guilty. The jury has spoken. Do not let your conscience invent ghosts." "It's not a ghost, sir," Captain Young replied, his voice shaking slightly, but his eyes hard. "It's a coordinate. It's a date. It's a fact. If Ryker is lying, he's the greatest fiction writer in history. But if he's telling the truth, then we are about to hang a man for following orders." Young walked out of that office with a new mission. He was no longer the prosecutor. In his heart, he had already defected. He went to the stockade that night. The guards were surprised to see the man who put Ryker on death row visiting after hours. When Young stood before the cell, Ryker didn't look up. He was polishing his boots, a habit of a soldier who refuses to let discipline die, even when he is about to.
"Sergeant," Young said. Ryker looked up, his eyes hollow but burning with that same maddening, stoic calm. "Here to check the measurements for the rope, Captain?" "No," Young said, unlocking the briefcase he had brought with him. "I'm here to ask you about the Chosin Reservoir. I'm here to ask you to help me prove I was wrong." That night, the roles reversed. The accuser became the defender. The doubt had retaken root, and it would tear the entire military justice system apart before it was finished. The retrial was coming, and this time, Captain Young wasn't fighting for a conviction. He was fighting for a life.
The Ghost Order, Hunting the Invisible Truth. Date, May 12, 1954. Location, U.S. Army Records Center, St. Louis, occupied Japan. The most dangerous thing in the United States Army is not a bullet, nor is it a landmine. It is a missing piece of paper. For Captain David Young, the man who had swapped the prosecutor's sword for the defender's shield, the enemy was no longer Sergeant Ryker. The enemy was the silence left behind by Colonel Whitaker. They called it the Ghost Order. In the rigid hierarchy of military command, if an order isn't written down, logged, and stamped in triplicate, it simply does not exist. Ryker claimed he was sent on a covert mission by Whitaker verbally. Whitaker was dead. Therefore, to the Army, the mission was a fantasy. The investigation phase was a descent into a bureaucratic labyrinth. Young wasn't just looking for evidence, he was fighting the institution he had sworn to serve. The Army wanted Ryker dead. A hanged traitor is a closed case. A living innocent man who was wrongly convicted is a scandal. Young began by retracing the final days of Colonel Whitaker. He spent nights in the damp archives of the Tokyo Administrative Building, drowning in cigarette smoke and coffee, his eyes scanning thousands of field reports. He was looking for a pattern, a shadow, a habit. He needed to prove that Whitaker was the kind of commander who operated off the books. He found something, not a document, but a reputation. Interviews with former officers revealed that Whitaker was a maverick, a man who distrusted radio communications because he knew the North Koreans were listening. He preferred human couriers for his most sensitive directives. This aligned with Ryker's story, but a reputation is not admissible evidence in a court-martial. The search turned to the living. Young needed a witness, someone who had seen Ryker enter Colonel Whitaker's tent on that freezing night in 1951. The investigation led Young to a muddy construction site in Osaka, where a former corporal named Bailey was working a bulldozer. Bailey had been Whitaker's perimeter guard. He was a man trying to forget the war, his hands calloused and his eyes guarded. "I don't want to talk about it, Captain," Bailey shouted over the roar of the diesel engine. "Ryker is a traitor. Everyone knows it." "I don't care what everyone knows," Young yelled back, grabbing the man's arm. "I care about what you saw. Did you see Sergeant Ryker go into the colonel's tent before he disappeared?" Bailey hesitated. The fear in his eyes wasn't of the captain, it was of the memories. "It was snowing. I saw a lot of men, shadows. I can't say for sure. And if I say I saw him and he turns out to be a spy, what does that make me, an accomplice?" This was the wall Young hit everywhere. Fear. The soldiers were terrified of being associated with a man branded a turncoat. The Ghost Order was toxic. To acknowledge it was to question the competence of the entire command structure. Meanwhile, in the stockade, the pressure on Ryker was mounting. The prosecution, now led by a ruthless major intent on correcting Young's mistake, was fast-tracking the retrial. They were blocking access to classified files, citing national security. They were erasing the footprints Young was trying to follow. But the ghost of Colonel Whitaker wouldn't stay buried. Young found a discrepancy in the unit's supply log.
On the night Ryker vanished, Whitaker had requisitioned a specific set of gear, non-standard issue, non-marked rations, and a captured enemy pistol, the exact kit Ryker was carrying when he was arrested. It was a breadcrumb, a tiny, insignificant detail that the sweeping broom of the cover-up had missed. Young held the requisition form in his trembling hands. It wasn't the order itself, it wasn't the smoking gun, it was the shadow of the gun. It proved that someone was being prepped for a block operation that night. "We have a ghost, Paul," Young told Ryker through the bars of the cell later that night. "Now we just have to make the court believe in him." The investigation had moved from a legal review to a detective thriller. They were chasing a phantom order through a fog of lies, and the only man who could confirm it was 6 feet under. But Young realized something crucial. You don't need to see the wind to know it's blowing. You just need to see the trees move. And the trees were definitely moving. The army was scared, and that meant the ghost order was real.
The court-martial begins, the theater of war. Date, June 1954. Location, Military Tribunal Courtroom, Tokyo, Japan. The air conditioning in the courtroom had failed, or perhaps it was just the collective heat of 50 men holding their breath. The wooden fans spun lazily overhead, chopping the humid air, but doing nothing to cool the tension. The court-martial of Sergeant Paul Ryker was not merely a legal proceeding, it was a gladiatorial arena. On one side sat the prosecutor, Major Merriam. He was a bulldog of a man, polished, aggressive, and carrying the full weight of the United States Army behind him. He didn't just want a conviction, he wanted an erasure. To him, Ryker was a disease that needed to be cut out to save the patient. On the other side sat Captain David Young, the man who had once condemned Ryker and now was his only shield. Young looked tired. His uniform was pressed, but his eyes betrayed sleepless nights spent chasing ghosts. Beside him sat Ryker, motionless. The sergeant looked less like a defendant and more like a statue carved from granite. He watched the officers who would decide his fate, the jury, with a gaze that was neither defiant nor pleading. It was simply waiting. "All rise," the bailiff barked. The trial began with a brutality that shocked the gallery. Major Merriam didn't waste time with subtleties. He opened his case by parading the visible facts, laying them out like corpses on a slab. "Gentlemen of the court," Merriam boomed, pacing in front of the jury box, "the defense will tell you fairy tales about secret missions and dead colonels. They will ask you to believe in the invisible, but I deal in the visible. And what is visible is this. Sergeant Ryker left his post. He walked into the enemy camp. He was found wearing enemy fatigues. He was found eating enemy rations while his brothers-in-arms starved in the cold." Merriam called his witnesses. They were soldiers from Ryker's old platoon, good men, honest men, and that was the problem. They testified to what they saw. They saw Ryker vanish. They saw him return months later, looking healthy, seemingly friendly with North Korean officers. "He didn't look like a prisoner, sir," one private testified, refusing to look at Ryker. "He looked like he belonged there." Captain Young watched the jury's faces. They were hardening. Every word was a nail in the coffin. When it was Young's turn to cross-examine, he didn't attack the witnesses, he attacked the perspective. "Private," Young asked, his voice calm, cutting through the heat, "if a man is ordered to infiltrate the enemy, to gain their trust, would he look like a prisoner, or would he have to look like a friend to survive?" I suppose he would have to look like a friend, sir," the private stammered. "So," Young pressed, leaning in, "the very evidence that you say proves he is a traitor, his appearance, his behavior, is exactly what we would expect to see if he was the perfect spy. Is that correct?" "Objection! Speculation!" "Sustained," the judge ruled. But the seed was planted.
Young wasn't fighting the facts, he was fighting the interpretation of the facts. The courtroom drama peaked when Young tried to introduce the concept of the ghost order. The prosecution laughed it off. They painted Ryker as a master manipulator who was using the tragic death of Colonel Whitaker to hide his cowardice. It is convenient, isn't it? The only man who can save you is dead. The only order that exists is in your head. Tell me, Sergeant, did you invent this mission before you realized the North Koreans were losing? Ryker stood up then. For the first time, the granite cracked. I didn't invent anything, Major. I did what I was told, and I'd do it again. The room went silent. It was the first time Ryker had spoken out of turn. Young felt the shift. It was subtle, but it was there. The absolute certainty of Ryker's guilt was beginning to fracture. But Young knew that doubt wasn't enough. In a court-martial, you don't win on maybe, you win on proof. And as the day ended, with the sun setting red through the high windows, Young knew he was losing. The prosecution had the logic. The defense had only a ghost. Young gathered his papers, his hands trembling slightly. He needed a miracle for the next day. He needed the one thing the army was hiding. He needed to prove that Ryker wasn't the only one with secrets. The real battle was about to begin, and the weapon would be a single overlooked date on a piece of paper that could shatter the prosecution's entire reality. The court adjourned, but the war in that room was far from over. The final verdict and vindication. The soldiers return. Date, June 14, 1954. Location, Military Tribunal Courtroom, Tokyo, Japan. The final day of the court-martial did not begin with a bang, but with a suffocating heaviness. The gallery was packed. Every seat was filled with officers, military police, and reporters who smelled blood. They had come to watch the final act of a tragedy, the hanging of Sergeant Paul Ryker. Major Merriam, the prosecutor, delivered a closing argument that was nothing short of a demolition. He paced the floor, his voice rising and falling with theatrical indignation. He painted Ryker not as a soldier, but an opportunist, a man who had traded the lives of his countrymen for a warm bed in a North Korean camp. Duty, Merriam thundered, pointing a finger at Ryker, is not a garment you take off when the weather gets cold. Sergeant Ryker abandoned his duty. He is a traitor, and the law demands his life. Ryker sat immobile. He didn't flinch. He looked at the floor, perhaps resigned to the fact that the truth doesn't always matter in the face of a good story. Then Captain David Young stood up. Young didn't have the theatrics of Merriam. He looked exhausted. He walked to the center of the room, holding a single thin piece of paper. It wasn't a secret order. It wasn't a confession. It was a weather report. "Gentlemen of the jury," Young began, his voice quiet, forcing the room to lean in. "The prosecution rests its entire case on the fact that Sergeant Ryker was seen fraternizing with the enemy. They claim he gave away the position of the 2nd Battalion at the Chosin Reservoir." Young held up the paper. "This is the meteorological log from November 1951. On the night Ryker allegedly defected, a blizzard grounded all air support. The 2nd Battalion was blind. They were exposed." He turned to the map on the wall. The North Korean commander knew this. He had the advantage. He should have attacked at dawn. He would have wiped the battalion out. But he didn't. Young turned to Ryker. He didn't attack because Sergeant Ryker told them not to. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Merriam jumped up to object, but the judge silenced him. Ryker told the enemy that the Americans had laid a trap. He told them that fresh artillery had moved in under the cover of the snow. It was a lie, a magnificent, dangerous lie, and the enemy believed him. They halted their advance for 24 hours to scout for artillery that didn't exist. Young slammed his hand on the table. That delay allowed the 2nd Battalion to retreat. It saved 400 lives. Sergeant Ryker wasn't selling secrets, gentlemen. He was selling time, and he paid for it with his reputation. The logic hit the room like a physical blow. The pieces suddenly fit. The treason was the mission. The collaboration was the camouflage. The deliberation took 4 hours. To Ryker, it felt like 4 decades. He stood in the holding cell, smoking a cigarette down to the filter. Captain Young leaned against the wall opposite him. There was nothing left to say. They were 2 men who had started as enemies and now bound by a terrifying truth. When the bailiff called them back, the courtroom was deathly silent. The president of the court, a hardened colonel with silver hair, stood up holding the verdict sheet. He didn't look at the prosecution. He looked directly at Ryker. Sergeant Paul Ryker, the colonel's voice echoed off the wood paneling, on the charge of violation of Article 104, aiding the enemy, this court finds you not guilty. The words hung in the air. For a second, no one moved. On the charge of desertion, not guilty. On all specifications and charges, not guilty. Ryker let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for 3 years. His shoulders slumped, the invisible weight finally dropping to the floor. There was no cheering. This wasn't a football game. It was a resurrection. Major Merriam packed his briefcase in silence, refusing to make eye contact. The reporters rushed for the doors to phone in the scoop. Ryker turned to Captain Young. The 2 men stood amidst the chaos of the clearing courtroom. Young extended his hand. Ryker took it. The grip was firm, calloused, and real. "You're a free man, Paul," Young said. "I'm a tired man, Captain, but I'm a soldier again." They walked out of the tribunal building into the blinding afternoon sun of Tokyo. The air smelled of exhaust and cherry blossoms. Sergeant Ryker adjusted his cap, squared his shoulders, and walked down the steps. He had beaten the charge. He had beaten the hangman, but most importantly, he had forced the world to acknowledge the truth. He had never stopped serving.